The empires of the future are the empires of the mind. In an era where almost anything seems conceivable, we may easily assume this statement was written in recent times when information manipulation is what controls the future. But it was actually coined in 1943 at the height of World War II by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. With no end in sight to the global war against tyranny, Churchill was fully engrossed in all the logistics and planning. Yet Churchill was astutely aware of the fundamental human nature of what lay behind the forces of change. It was not merely the steely militarism of the Germans and Japanese, but the manipulation of ideas, the dominion of the mind by dark worldviews that offered empty promises of a utopian economic future. Fast forward 80 years and we see that Churchill had a certain prophetic instinct. The political empires of Europe that once dominated the world via the controls and instruments of the state have long been eclipsed by an information revolution that has leveled the old order of power structures, where a new knowledge economy manipulates and distributes information as its most precious commodity. Like the financial economy, this knowledge economy is based on the foundation of personal choice, where you are free to create and consume what you will. Sadly, our fallen nature means that information is manipulated to attain pleasure or power rather than pursuing outcomes that produce real value. We are too often allured into consuming information that lacks value and instead creates confusion. Quality of information should be determined instead by its power to enable people to make wise, values-based decisions. Sadly, the information bombardment that we pay attention to has proven to provoke fear, raise our stress, and fuel social division. In economic terms, currency is a medium through which we exchange goods and services. The value of currency is determined by its ability to acquire that which is desired. Therefore, in a digital economy, information is a form of currency with varying levels of purchasing power depending on its ability to manipulate outcomes. However, information supplied in this digital economy has been cheapened with an overabundant supply of fake news and clickbait and celebrity gossip, which in turn devalues its purchasing power. Accurate information and relevant information is a more valuable currency that purchases thoughtful understanding and practical wisdom. But agenda-driven social media content that's laced with misinformation and fear has flooded the information market, making genuine understanding and wisdom a rare commodity. Our job as Christian leaders must be to restore the value of wisdom and truth in today's knowledge economy. But before looking for the solution, let's attempt to understand why the problem exists. It's easy to blame the mainstream media or the woke educational system, but instead we must start with ourselves first. The inverse relationship between the abundance of poor quality information and the scarcity of high quality wisdom and understanding is only due to our choices regarding where we pay our attention. Our attention is where information is processed. That which is perceived as irrelevant is disregarded. Only that which is helpful to one's self-interest or goals is kept to support our decisions and actions, whether good or bad. Hence, the mind justifies what the heart has already chosen. Or to say it another way, we only pay attention to that which will support our self-centered choices. Former Google strategist James Williams explains this reality in economic terms. He says, for most of human history, we've lived in environments of information scarcity. But when information becomes abundant, attention becomes a scarce resource. The problem, however, is determining what a person gives attention to: sensational or fear-based content versus truthful, actionable wisdom. The determination reveals what people genuinely value. Just as how we steward our material treasure reveals what's in our hearts, How we steward our mind through what we pay attention to shows our true values. At the dawn of the information revolution in the 70s, Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert Simon noted, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever information consumes. It consumes the attention of its recipients." Hence, a wealth of information can create a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention more efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. We must consider what we pay when we identify precisely what we are paying attention to. Our attention span operates under the same principle of opportunity cost because its finite capacity is a scarce resource. The capacity of our attention span is limited by the amount of time available to pay attention to a matter. We pay attention through our choice to trade our focus by ignoring one thing in order to focus on something else. Like our choice-based economic system, we must acknowledge that consumers and knowledge producers are the ultimate decision makers deciding how to allocate an attention's scarce resources. And as with cheap and desirable material goods, the massive supply of sound bites and sensational narratives and fake news from both the left and the right often provide cheap entertainment that the mind gravitates towards because consuming information like this is cheaper than engaging in critical analysis. In his book, The Death of Expertise, Tom Nichols reflects this sentiment. He says, "Never have so many people had so much access to knowledge and yet have been so resistant to learning anything." The attention deficit seriously undermines our ability to think critically, independently, and strategically. Returning to Williams from Google, we must recognize not just the irony, but the inherent danger that ensues when abundant information is available and little attention is given to understanding and wisdom. He warns, the decentralized infrastructure of information management could enable the most centralized systems of attention management in human history. Today, just a few people at a handful of companies now can shape what billions of human beings think and do. What people pay attention to is primarily driven by the information they assume they need rather than what they actually need. It's easy to be distracted by the onslaught of messages and narratives and clickbait that lure us into their manipulated realities. Rarely do information sources structure their messaging to equip people to think critically and determine their own conclusions. Today's political and corporate messaging especially targets people's untested assumptions because untested assumptions shortcut the more protracted process of evaluating what we think in order to determine an accurate conclusion. Our assumptions attempt to assure us that we can separate the consequences of our decisions from the mental justifications behind them. Firmly held assumptions tend to undermine the essential task of critical thinking. They result in unintended consequences for both good and ill. We tend to pay attention to distractions in order to mask more painful realities going on in our lives, but those distractions rarely provide long-term satisfaction. Society is constantly searching for the latest cheap solution to problems that we created by our lack of wisdom. This has become evident with many Americans assuming that even socialist ideas can solve apparently current economic injustices. A recent study by the Cultural Research Center led by George Barna found that 23% of respondents believe that individual property ownership is bad for society. People have grown to distrust the institutions of knowledge curation on the left and the right. Like the uncoupling of the dollar to the gold standard, our universities and print and digital media have deconstructed knowledge, stripping it of any authority and value, thus leaving it open to be manipulated and peddled for the elite's agenda. When faith in the truth is undermined, a culture of misinformation ensues, and trust in social institutions is sadly lost. Without trust, faith and knowledge declines, and the credibility and the authority of a nation's institutions are undermined. In a digital information age especially, Christian leaders must therefore pay attention to what is true and how to use information to restore the value of understanding and wisdom that can empower others and policymakers towards good choices. Our mission is to discover and apply biblical wisdom to world issues and problems that will lead to a recovery in a knowledge economy that has otherwise declined in value. So how do we pay attention in order to gain understanding and wisdom in an information-saturated, knowledge-abundant society? The prophet Daniel, living as a young captive in Babylon, provides an excellent model. Every time Daniel was called upon to address problems at the highest level, it was evident that the elites of his day, who presided over an abundance of knowledge, operated themselves with a scarcity of wisdom. Thus, they had nothing of value to offer in times of crisis. Babylon was known as the intellectual center of the ancient world. It was the leader in applied mathematics, known for its scientific accomplishments, its architectural prowess, and its advanced legal system. Its dynamic international trade contributed to its military might and its global sense of hegemony. Its university was also likely seen as the same way that we view Ivy League schools here in America today. Yet despite the Babylonians' abundance of knowledge, they lacked understanding when confronted with real shifts in global power. But for Daniel, rather than being cloistered away with the Jewish captives, Daniel was instead thrust into this university at Babylon, where he was taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. It was through this process that we see that God gave him, quote-unquote, learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. The Hebrew word for learning, mada, has three connotations in particular: to discern, to distinguish, and to consider. It was a type of learning that required Daniel to pay attention to what was of value. To discern is to pay attention to the authority of information. To distinguish is to pay attention to the accuracy of information. And to consider is to pay attention to the application of information. To pay attention is to ask questions that enable us to focus on deriving understanding and wisdom from the knowledge we receive. To pay attention to the authority of information, we must ask questions about the credibility of the information source. We must discern the motivation that lies behind how information is being presented. To pay attention to the accuracy of information, we must ask questions that evaluate the quality of that information that reveals its credibility. We look for evidence and we seek to distinguish whether the conclusion it arrives at is perhaps plausible or just simply outlandish. To pay attention to the application of information, we consider whether or not we agree with how it's being used. We pay attention to nuance and whether aspects of the information can be either regarded and respected or perhaps not, even if we disagree with its conclusion. Paying attention to biblical wisdom through this type of learning is a rare and precious discipline, even in an information age. The writer of Proverbs states, "Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding." The irony of this era where information abounds while understanding and wisdom have become scarce resources is the challenge that Christian leaders must address. A challenge to pay attention and buy the truth, so we, like Daniel, can become problem solvers in the midst of chaos and disillusionment in the world system.